Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our panel discussion here at EuropaCamp on the topic, Does Democracy Need a Makeover? My name is Caroline Will. I am an editor at Debating Europe, the online discussion platform designed to create a genuine conversation between Europe's citizens, politicians, and experts. And we reached out to our community of young European citizens and asked them to send us their questions and their suggestions on how to make over European democracy and indeed how to make it fit for the 21st century. And we have gathered an excellent panel who will discuss their ideas and suggestions. So let me introduce our panelists. First, starting in person with Helene von Bismarck. She is a historian, journalist, and visiting research fellow at the Centre of British Politics and Government at King's College London, as well as a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. And in recent years, her work has focused on Brexit, the rise of populism in Europe, and the role of history in international relations. Thank you for joining us, Helene. Then joining us remotely, we have Alberto Alemanno. He is the Jean Monnet Professor of Law and Public Policy at the HEC Paris, and he is one of the leading researchers in the democratization of the European Union. And in addition to that, he is also the founder and the director of The Good Lobby, a non-profit civic startup that has kickstarted a movement for ethical, responsible, and sustainable lobbying. Welcome, Alberto. And then last but not least, also joining us remotely is Sarah Händel. And Sarah has a background in political science and peace studies, and she is a board member of Mehr, Demokratie. And with Mehr, Demokratie, she starts initiatives for innovating democracy to make it more inclusive, more direct, and more open, and more productive. For example, Mehr Demokratie paved the way for the implementation of randomly selected citizens panels on the federal level. Thank you for joining us too, Sarah. So, great. Let's turn straight to the questions and ideas by the young Europeans from our Debating Europe community. The title of our panel is Does Democracy Need a Makeover? And that obviously applies that there's maybe something that is not working quite as well as it should, or maybe that some things are a little bit outdated. So I'm just going to start with a short round of questions from our users who are observing the current state of democracy and have some worries and problems, have spotted some problems with what they are witnessing at the moment. So first up, I have a question from Andreas, who says, democracy means rule of the people, so decision-making powers should lie with the people. But our current representative system, where we only get to vote every 4 years, is inefficient, too bureaucratic, and it actually discourages political participation of the people. So, given that, does our democracy need a makeover? And here I will go straight to Sarah, our democracy expert from Mehr Demokratie. What do you think? Do we need to change our current system to encourage more political participation of the people?
Yeah, I think that's an easy question to answer. We say definitely yes, we have to change because the world changed. Because actually people change, they're much more informed now, they're much more grown up now, they're much more willing to participate, they have the wish to participate. But not only our people have changed, also our problems have changed considerably in the last decades. So actually we have new problems and we have new people, but we still have an old system. So that for us doesn't match. We think exactly that democracy has to be reinvented. And this is the perfect time for it because actually we don't have that much time left to become more efficient in our democracies. And efficient, I mean in that we need to find ways to let people be part of democracy in a way that they feel like they have ownership in what they create with democracy. So because we have big changes ahead, we necessarily have to adapt our society to a new style of living, but we cannot do that against the people, we have to do it with them. And now it's time to create actually the means of really integrating them in changing and making them a part of it, so they actually will keep it up and not deflect on it, because in democracies when people are unsatisfied they can actually block needed change quite easily. So that's why we really have to get them into the processes in a more efficient way than now.
Thank you, Sarah. I think, yeah, your answer is quite clear. Yes, we do need a makeover. I'm very interested whether our two other panelists would agree. I'm going to go sort of straight more into the concrete problems that you've also already mentioned. Yeah, and one thing that we've seen is that obviously the pandemic has sort of exacerbated existing problems, and we have witnessed some democratic backsliding in some European countries because some leaders like Viktor Orban have used sort of have used the pandemic as an excuse to restrict human rights and the rule of law even more. Here we have a question on this topic from our user David, who says, Hungary repeatedly violates the rule of law and the elections were held under sketchy circumstances. I feel like even cutting Hungary's funds won't deter somebody power-hungry like Orban. So, my question, what else does the EU need to do against its member states' rule of law violations? And here I turn to a real expert on the rule of law, Alberto. So, do you share David's views, and what else does the EU need to do against its member states' rule of law violations?
Thank you for the great question, David. There's no doubt that what the European Union has been experiencing over the last 5-6 years is a pathological situation when one country which belongs to the Union is no longer respecting the basic principles of the rule of law. That basically means ensuring that the institutions are independent and they're doing their work, particularly the judiciary, but also the media. Then we clearly see a difficult situation to be in. Why? Because as you might have seen over the last weekend, the majority of Hungarians are supporting a government which in reality has been departing from those principles. So what the European Union, meaning the different other member states, should actually do? Well, they should act. And the reason for that is not because they want to interfere into the political situation of Hungary, but because the lack of judicial independence in Hungary, but also in Poland and in some other countries, not to the same extent, do have effect also on our life in Spain, where I am at the moment, in Portugal, in Slovakia, in Finland, all across the European Union. Given the socio-economic integration existing in Europe, the lack of respect of the rule of law in Hungary or in any other country will affect and therefore also change our life. Let's imagine a situation in which the Hungarian judges should decide about the custody of the kids in a mixed couple. Well, this is going to affect us. And overall, we can say this is a European issue. Up to now, the European Commission, which is the guardian of the treaty, has been very, very cautious in going against and going after those countries. And what I've been suggesting over the years and writing is that the European Union should rely more on civil society organizations. We need mobilizations of people all across Europe supporting solidarity for those Hungarians who don't necessarily are happy with the current situation and trying to give this kind of bottom-up legitimacy, which is currently lacking. We cannot expect the institutions alone to actually push against a democratically legitimate prime minister like Mr. Orban is today.
Thank you, Alberto. What you said just now also reminded me of something that we heard at the earlier panel on democracy in crisis, where one of the panelists said that it won't be Ursula von der Leyen or another faceless bureaucrat that saves Europe, but it will be the citizens and the people of Europe. So that's, I found a very great sentiment and maybe something that we will hear about later. And now I want to turn to Helene, and sticking with the topic that we had before with Hungary and Orban and the developments there. We got a question from our user Josephine, who was concerned, as are many of our users, about the war in Ukraine and the impact it will have on Europe. And she says, or she asks, what influence will the war in Ukraine have on European democracies? With Orban's re-election, Europe's most anti-democratic leader, who is also a good friend of Putin, got another term. Putin is influential in Hungary, and Russia has been trying to spread anti-democratic sentiment in Europe for years. To me, it seems like they are currently redoubling their efforts. I see a scary amount of pro-Russian misinformation around the Ukraine war on social media. So my question to you, Helena, as an expert on populism, what would you answer Josephine?
Well, I think she's right to be concerned. Of course, of course it's a challenge to European democracy, what's happening in Ukraine. Any huge crisis is, and this is a really unprecedented crisis of European security, I would say, since the creation of the European Union. And what we're seeing at the moment, she was referring to pro-Russian disinformation on social media. We're really in the middle of a disinformation war as well as a real one, and it affects us all. This whole position of saying this is a war in Ukraine and we're helping, but we're not involved, we're kidding ourselves. We might not be at war militarily, but this is a struggle for over really the future of this continent. And we're deluding ourselves if we think if this stays, militarily contained to Ukraine, the rest of us are just going to be fine. It's not that easy. Speaking about disinformation, is what's so worrying is that there is a lot of disinformation that you probably wouldn't even recognize because the most sort of insidious and dangerous things aren't even openly pro-Russian or pro-something. They might actually appeal to you and appeal to your values and sort of push all your buttons and make you agree and make you retweet them and then, or whatever, share them on whatever platform, but actually it's not true, and it's so the idea is to confuse and to also to make people question what truth even is. I mean, Hannah Arendt, she once said that the most dangerous situation in any given society is not when there's a lot of falsehoods around, but when people on a large scale start to doubt that there really is such a thing as a distinction between truth and falsehood. And I think that is a situation I'm not saying we find ourselves in that situation, but there's a danger, and there are parts of this world and political movements where there already is this feeling of doubt, of saying this can't be true, I refuse. People don't even discuss the issues, they just say this issue doesn't exist, it's fake news.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it even goes so far, and I think in Germany we have witnessed this a lot, and we actually also had a question from this by Linda, where she talks about this exact problem with misinformation, and that people are not even believing anymore that we live in a democratic society, and they are going on the streets of that, and then we can really see, I think, how this misinformation is a threat to European democracy. So now we had a short round of questions from our Debating Europe community, where we sort of asked, does our democracy need a makeover? And I think in some ways all our panelists agreed that something needs to be done, at least, on be it the way that we structure how often we have elections and citizen involvement, but of course also on a larger scale in the EU, how we interact with democratic backsliding, but also with misinformation that is threatening our societies. But now let's turn to how we actually want to make over our democracies. What do we actually want them to look like? And here we have some really nice suggestions from our users. First of all, from Carlotta, who says, citizen participation is certainly the future of democracy. In between elections, there are very few ways to really participate in decision-making processes. That's why I think projects like the Conference on the Future of Europe shouldn't just happen once, but they should become permanent. Do you agree? That's her question. And maybe as a brief explanation, I'm sure people have heard of it, but the Conference on the Future of Europe is a project that the EU institutions launched to involve citizens in sharing their suggestions and ideas for the future of Europe. And next to an online platform and events, a very crucial element of the Conference on the Future of Europe were citizens' assemblies. And now I turn to Sarah, because you have organized similar citizens' assemblies in Germany with Mehr Demokratie. Why do you think there's such a good format, and do you agree with Carlotta that the Conference on the Future of Europe should be permanent?
Yes, I definitely agree that citizen assemblies are a really good instrument to actually bring people together, because we have randomly selected people. That means from every background, every age, every situation in life they can come together and really share their views, hear from experts about the topic, and then discuss it with each other. And I think that's really something our democracy needs right now, making room for people to come together as people, as full people as they are, not just with an opinion, but with everything they have, and make each own and make each other listen to each other, because that's something we don't have much in our society anymore, because we have a lot of exchange online, but that's not listening to each other. And these platforms we have it on, they are not made for listening to each other. They're actually made to provoke us to be emotional, and that's not what we need to come together. Emotions should be part of the process, but they should be measured, and they should be having a room where everybody can feel safe and actually be honest about their emotions. And that's something citizens' assemblies are a really important first step to go there. And we also agree that they should be permanent on an EU level. But the thing is also, that is the problem with the citizen assemblies. They produce really good results, but how are they implemented then? And then we come to something which we have a lot on EU level, that there is power blockage, because it's not easy to change something. The big questions are the hardest to change. So what we see now with the Conference of Europe is also that we have some really good results that the citizen worked up, but we have not that much chances that they are actually implemented. Some of them, yes, but the ones who are more important, they probably won't be implemented. So we should think of a structure now that is actually assuring permanent citizen participation, but is also assuring that actually it changes something. And that's a way more bigger question still. So at this point in time, for me personally, it wouldn't be enough to just put permanent citizen assemblies. We just think that it's the perfect time in history, actually, to give now Europe a whole new constitution. And when you give Europe a new constitution, then you can think structurally of how and in which means and which instruments are actually useful of citizen participation, and how you put them into the whole construct that we have on the European level. And that needs to be considered really carefully and really profoundly. So we think there should be a year-long process where, again, directly elected people can work up a totally new constitution, and doing that together with the people. So by a process like that, you can integrate the people in renewing Europe, and on the same page, they will propose a lot of instruments of participation that you can then implement in a structural way, so they actually have a chance of also changing the outcome of European policies at the end.
Thank you, Sarah. That's indeed a really fascinating format, I find, and something that should be looked into more. And let's see, what actually comes of it. We got also several suggestions for other means of citizens' participation, and one of them was from our user Stadex, who says, I think Europe needs more direct citizens' involvement. As a Swiss person, I have experience with referenda and ballot initiatives. I think direct democracy doesn't damage representative democracy, it completes it. In my country, politicians know that when they pass a law, citizens can recall it if they don't agree with that law, and this leads to more compromise. So he asked, do you agree that we need more direct democracy in the EU? And here I turn to Helene. Obviously, Stadex is from Switzerland, but the most famous or infamous example of a referendum in Europe obviously has been the Brexit referendum, and you've studied that a lot, potentially at nauseam. And so my question is, would you agree with Stadex that direct democracy is a good idea?
No, I wouldn't. Absolutely not. I mean, I respect that coming from Switzerland, the Swiss example is quite interesting, because it obviously depends on how you do it. If you do it, referenda on huge questions such as leaving the European Union, or for that matter, leaving the United Kingdom, something which people want in Scotland, I think that's a terrible idea, because it opens the door to populism, to demagoguery, to simplification, to emotionalization. It takes a huge issue with lots of consequences pretend that this is just a yes or no question, and then that's what we saw in the UK, and then the trouble begins when the answer is yes, then how do you do it? And then the trouble begins. And the Swiss example is obviously different, because if you have it for one very specific law, that's different. So I get his point, and I respect that. Generally speaking, when we talk about, a makeover for democracy, I'm all for, I think it begins with making us into more engaged Democrats. It's not so much about the system, it's about us participating in the system, it's about engagement, education, participation, and dialogue, and that's why I wasn't asked the question, but I agree it should be made permanent, this European Forum. I just be careful to think, one thing we are also seeing in lots of countries, and actually something which got us into this mess we find ourselves now is Ukraine, especially in Germany, is we've had decades of short-termism in policymaking. So basically, you get elected, and you always have to, you always wonder what gets you re-elected, obviously. I mean, this is how democracy should work. But when it comes to questions such as climate change or security or geopolitics, you need to, be a strategic thinker, and that gets, so short-termism gets into the way. So I worry if we introduce too much sort of direct democracy into our system, that this could really actually hinder us in thinking, in questions that affect future generations, such as, for example, climate change.
Thank you, Helene. And maybe, maybe we can talk a little bit about it later as well, but maybe for questions such as this, dialogue, as you've mentioned just before, maybe assemblies could be a more appropriate way to at least gauge what the political opinion is. And then I have another question, or another aspect that was very important to several of our users. And this is a question from Paolo, who asks, how can we make democracy more accessible to people from marginalized communities? People from historically excluded groups are often excluded from processes or do not feel safe to join. So how can we build a democracy where everybody is included? And here I turned to Alberto. Earlier we sort of asked you in your capacity as law professor. Now I'm asking you as the director of the Good Lobby, where you're working towards a plural, inclusive and democratic society. What would you answer, Paolo?
Yes, Paolo. Over the years, we have been witnessing the emergence of a panoply of channels of participation, including at the European level, right? We have the right to petition, we have the European Citizen Initiative, we have public consultations, and all these forms of participation, both at the national and European level, presuppose that everyone has the same ability in terms of epistemic ability, resources, literacy, that enable that person, that organization to have a say. And this is obviously false. So we need to move away from what I call the formal understanding of the principle of equality and understand the principle of equality in a more substantive way. That basically means to impose a procedural duty on the state, on the European institutions, to make an extra effort to allow everybody, all interests, to actually be heard. And this kind of shift away from formal equality to a more substantive one requires an activity which is very demanding, not only for the public authorities themselves, but for many other actors. And there's one in particular, which I think is a bit the elephant in the room these days, in particular, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is what is the role of the private sector, of the business in the political engagement. We all know, if you look at all the statistics, that 70-80% of the meetings taking place by our politicians and third parties is with business representatives. And just a minority of 15-20% of meetings actually do happen with associations coming from civil society. So how can we equalize access to power? What kind of methods can we use? Certainly, we should become a bit more creative in trying to split this responsibility between public authorities. We should actually make this extra step, not necessarily requiring super high literacy in order to take part to a public consultation, but also from companies, from corporations. They all should also play finally a role instead of free riding of the critical democratic infrastructure of the European Union, of our nation states, and contributing by doing that. Just an example, something that is practiced today in a few states is what we call civic time off, allowing the employees of a particular companies to take a day off when there is election day, but also what I call lobbying aid, which looks a bit like legal aid, which allows employees during the office hours to volunteer, to work pro bono for civil society organizations who do not have the tools, the expertise to actually get access to decision makers. So unless we make this kind of extra push from the bottom up, and we involve also the private sector, we're not going to be able to get everybody on board. Then this is key, because it's very easy to call for greater participation in the space between elections, but then if only the usual suspects or those socioeconomically more advantaged or those represented, we risk also, again, another form of overrepresentation. And we know today that those who actually vote, so the exercise, the basic fundamental political rights of voting, are already slightly above the average when it comes to their socioeconomics, their literacy, their educational standing, and also their consumer power. So we need to avoid making such a mistake of just pushing for participation as it is, but trying to actually equalize that participation between different interests and groups of society.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting, particularly also mentioning this aspect of the public sector involvement with the example of Ukraine. I want to turn to a sort of concluding round of questions, which is quite a broad question, I would say, but maybe one also allows to both, bring in some new aspects, but also to maybe respond to the things that we have heard earlier from the panelists. And that is a question from Cleopatra, who asked, how do we manage to build bridges between people who seem to fundamentally disagree on key issues? For example, between vaccination advocates and COVID deniers, or between people who believe in climate change and those who don't. And maybe I turn to Helene first, just because obviously in the Brexit example we also witnessed a huge amount of polarization. What would you say to this question?
Well, I wish I had the answer. It's not that easy. I mean, just generally speaking, I think one, especially now after the pandemic, I mean, this is an online forum and it's fantastic, all the things we can do online, and we can use it to encourage people to inform themselves and participate. But I think I worry that, especially because of the pandemic, we meet too little actually face to face. And really nothing is a replacement for sort of personal interactions, and we need more of those. And I think things could be done to encourage this. I mean, you can start in the schools. You can, it's all kinds of initiatives to get people engaged and interested in politics from a very young age. I don't have the magical answer to this. I think it's also a balancing act, because on the one hand, you want to bridge the divide, and you want to engage with the other side, and that's hugely important. But what we've also seen, especially in the media in recent years in different contexts, is this danger of both-sidism and false equivalence. So you have a pretty extreme position, such as COVID doesn't exist or is a hoax, and a position of a epidemiologist who has studied this for 20 years, and who is he also has a political opinion. Not only does he know a lot about COVID, but also he is on the very careful side. And you can argue that maybe he overdoes it or she overdoes it. But then to put these two people, some disgruntled person who is just uninformed and in complete denial of reality, and a person who is very informed but maybe has a bit of an extreme opinion, to put them on TV together and to present this as an equal debate, and then the presenter tries to sort of find common ground in the middle. The middle, is not necessarily the truth. So as I said, it's hugely important to interact in person and to try and, put yourself in somebody else's shoes. But the danger there is also a danger of presenting false equivalences.
Thank you very much. Even though you didn't have the magical answer, I think that was nonetheless a really good point. And maybe indeed also again a good point for the media to take a look at themselves and take a look at how do we present issues, who do we invite, and yeah, what arguments do we present. So maybe one of the other panelists does have the magical answer. We'll see. I see that Sarah raised her hand, so I'm waiting for your magical answer to the question: how do we manage to build bridges between people with fundamentally opposing ideas?
Yeah, I think there's probably never a magical answer, but I have to disagree a little bit with the speaker before. I actually think we could even do more online. I think the pandemic opened up a whole new window for people to interact with each other. And I don't think we need to necessarily interact personally. What I meant with it, we need a new form of interaction, and that can be done easily online. And actually for people who are excluded now, like mothers or fathers with young children who cannot have time to go somewhere, like doing this online is a big change to take part if that couldn't be done before. So the pandemic showed us that we can do that. And I'm speaking about when you interact, like we have to have different ways. And what we do right now with More Demokratie is just letting people come one evening, come together, and then we have little breakouts, and everybody, like 4 people in a room, and then everybody's.
So much for digital interaction. Okay, this is not ideal.
The problems of digital connections. Sarah, we can't hear you, sorry.
Now it's okay?
Now we can hear you, yes.
Okay, so this is about like everybody speaks 5 minutes. It's about people like learn to listen to each other, and also it's not only about arguments always, it's about the reasons behind the arguments also, and that's what we need to work on. We cannot just discuss about topics like with arguments, because the arguments have different roots into the people's motivations, and that's the next level of democracy. When we interact with each other, we have to see behind the arguments, and we have to have room to extract the real motivations behind people, and that's then when bridges can be built between each other, because we really can understand each other anew. And I really have to say also that I don't think we should dismiss direct democracy as a tool that easily. I know Brexit went wrong, but we have to ask ourselves, what can we do better? And if we have, for example, randomly selected citizen initiatives that propose a law that is inclusive and that is every side has been heard. So if we have a good structure of creating new laws, then it's not that a big risk to take a vote upon it. And also with the fake news, I mean, we didn't even really start to fight it. When we look at Taiwan, a country which has the most digitalized democracy, they have all new tools of fighting fake information. They use a strategy called humor against rumor. And they have like professional comedians work for the governments and for all the ministries and have like counter initiatives. If there's fake news out there, they counter it in a funny way, which gets then shared a lot by the people, and then even overwhelms the rumor. And things like that, like we have to keep up with the threat. Our democracies have to go digital big time, and we still didn't start to think how they can do it, what means they can use it, and then we will be more prepared to actually counter the threats we see now that are attacking democracies. But for me, we are way too shy now, and we need to embrace these new possibilities, and we better start doing it sooner rather than later.
Thank you, Sarah. Before I turn to Alberto for the concluding remark, Helene signaled to me that she would like to very briefly respond to Sarah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I mean, I have absolutely nothing against more online engagement. I'm all for it. I spent most of my time online. I'm just saying that it's not a complete replacement for the other, and now that the pandemic is over, we should embrace the personal interaction again as well. That doesn't mean that I'm not completely in agreement with you that huge things can be done online. I have 3 tiny children. The youngest is 10 months old, so I see you. As far as referenda are concerned, I was talking about great, really generational, huge decisions such as leaving the European Union. I said that what we have in Switzerland is different. And also, I find your proposal interesting, this idea of citizens proposing a law. That's not something we've discussed before. That is a different issue, and I'm not necessarily opposed against this. I'm just warned against this idea that I think in one of the questions which didn't come up now, but which we looked at before, somebody said, oh, every 4 years is not enough, and I just worry that if there are constant, depending on what questions we answer, but I just worry about politicians no longer, engaging in bigger questions because they're always worried about next day's debate.
Thank you, Helene. And then now I turn to the concluding answer from Alberto. What would you answer, Cleopatra? How do we manage to build bridges again?
Thank you. Well, I think it's pretty clear that there is a case for what we call democratic innovation, which might sound a bit of an oxymoron, right? How democracy can change and become innovative. But this is experiment more. We need to take more risk, because unless we do so, we're going to basically make the system even less credible. And I think today the major challenge is really about making our democratic system more responsive to people demand. And it's pretty clear that we cannot wait for 4 or 5 years before getting a new government in order to get anything delivered to us. And this is the space we need to focus on much more. This is the space in between elections. And this is the space in which we need to experiment democratic innovation tools. We have been discussing about deliberation. Also, the European Union is experimenting on deliberative democracy, acting on the renewal of democracy in Florence only a few months ago. And let me tell you, it was very refreshing to be in a room with 200 citizens randomly selected who would have, and to feel comfortable to discuss about policy issues which seems to be so far away from their daily life, but they are not. They're actually defining their quality of life. So there is a pedagogical function that should be unleashed in the way in which we make democracy work. It is important to realize that all these tools are complementary one another. We are not going to get rid of representatives. We're going to continue voting our representatives for a long time, but this is not enough, and it's pretty clear to us. So we need to complement the representative dimension of democracy with a participatory, with a deliberative one, and making sure that the participatory input, for instance, the 178 recommendations coming from citizens all across Europe, will feed into the representative democracy. That interface between participatory issues too, with those recommendations is still an open question, meaning we haven't really hammered down methodologically how to make sure these competing claims of representativeness, the representative citizens who have been somehow elected and those who have been randomly selected, can together define the future of our democracy. And I think much of what we need to that question, how do we ensure every single day that citizens' preferences, how we aggregate them in their, let's say, political process, will be responded to by the political elected, those we are currently electing and trying to hold accountable. And this is, again, the kind of experiment which is already happening today. Our democracies not look like they will. Let's try to contribute, each of us, every single stakeholder of our society, from philanthropy to civil society, all the way to businesses, public authorities, to making our democracy much more responsive to the needs and the challenges whose nature, as highlighted before, has certainly changed, has become certainly more transnational. So that's where we need to be ready to pick up the challenges.
Thank you very much, Alberto. I think there was a little bit of technical issues, but I think the key message got across. That was the last question. So to wrap up a little bit, I think in the panel we highlighted quite some issues that users of Debating Europe, young European citizens, but also the experts from the panel see. To some extent, we agree that there is a need for a makeover, and what that makeover should look like, of course, remains to be subject of further discussion. I would like to thank our guests, Alberto Alemanno, Helene von Bismarck, and Sarah Händel for the great discussion. And I'd also like to thank ZEIT-Stiftung and the entire EuropaCamp team, as well as the audience, of course, and wish everybody a nice night with the next events at EuropaCamp.